When I was 8 years old, my parents thought it was hilarious to watch me crawl across the kitchen floor, begging for scraps of food like a dog. They'd point and laugh, sometimes even recording it on their phones for their own twisted entertainment. What they didn't know was that their neighbor, Mrs. Henderson, had been secretly documenting everything through her security camera that faced our backyard window. 3 years later, that footage would destroy their lives and change mine forever. This is the story of how hidden camera evidence exposed the truth that no one wanted to believe. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. My name is Marcus Chen, and I need to tell you about the darkest chapter of my childhood before I can explain how everything changed. Growing up in Millfield, Ohio, I lived in what everyone thought was the perfect suburban household. My father, Richard Chen, was a respected insurance adjuster, and my mother, Patricia Chen, worked part-time at the local library. To the outside world, we were the ideal American family living in a 2-story colonial house with a white picket fence. But inside those walls, a different reality existed. The first time I remember being denied food was when I was 6 years old. I had accidentally spilled orange juice on my mother's favorite tablecloth during breakfast. Instead of cleaning it up and moving on, my parents decided this warranted punishment. They sent me to my room without finishing my cereal, telling me I could eat when I learned to be more careful. What started as missing one meal became missing the entire day's worth of food. The pattern escalated slowly. At first, food restrictions were tied to specific infractions. I'd lose dinner for talking back, miss lunch for forgetting to make my bed, or skip breakfast for being too slow getting ready for school. My parents framed it as discipline, explaining that children in other countries would be grateful for any food at all, and that I needed to learn the value of not wasting things. By the time I turned 7, the reasons for withholding food became increasingly arbitrary. I might lose meals for breathing too loudly during their television shows, for asking too many questions about homework, or simply because they felt I was getting too comfortable with regular eating schedules. They told me that hunger would teach me resilience and make me stronger than other kids. The psychological manipulation was carefully crafted. My parents would prepare elaborate meals for themselves while I sat at the table with an empty plate, watching them enjoy foods that made my stomach ache with longing. They'd describe every bite in detail, talking about how delicious the pot roast was or how perfectly seasoned the vegetables were. When I'd ask for just a small portion, they'd shake their heads and remind me that I hadn't earned food that day. The worst part wasn't the physical hunger, though that was excruciating. The worst part was how they made me beg. They'd place food just out of reach and tell me that if I really wanted it, I needed to show them how much I appreciated their generosity. This meant crawling on my hands and knees across the kitchen floor, sometimes barking like a dog, or performing other humiliating acts that they found amusing. I remember one particularly cruel evening in late spring when I was 8. My parents had ordered pizza for dinner, and the smell filled our entire house. I hadn't eaten anything since a small piece of toast that morning, nearly 12 hours earlier. When I asked if I could have a slice, my father looked at my mother, and they both started grinning in that way that made my stomach drop. "You know the rules, Marcus," my mother said, her voice sickeningly sweet. "Good boys who want food need to show us they deserve it." I knew what this meant. I got down on my hands and knees and began crawling toward them, my 8-year-old mind desperate enough to abandon any sense of dignity. As I crawled across the cold tile floor, both of my parents started laughing, not just chuckling, but full-blown laughter, as if watching their own child debase himself was the funniest thing they'd ever seen. "Look at him," my father wheezed between laughs. "He really thinks he's going to get some pizza." "Should we make him bark first?" my mother asked, pulling out her phone to record me. I stayed on my hands and knees, looking up at them with tears in my eyes, waiting for permission to speak. The humiliation burned in my chest, but the hunger was stronger than my pride. I was just a child, and I needed food. "Please," I whispered. I'm really hungry. They laughed harder. My mother aimed her phone at me, capturing my desperate face, for their private collection of what they called Marcus's greatest hits. These recordings were something they'd sometimes watch later, replaying my most humiliating moments during their evening entertainment. All right, my father finally said, wiping tears from his eyes. Since you put on such a good show, you can have the crusts. But only the crusts. He took a slice of pizza and carefully ate everything except the crust, leaving me with the dry, barely there remnants of bread. I ate those crusts gratefully, even though they did almost nothing to satisfy the gnawing emptiness in my stomach. My parents continued eating their pizza, occasionally glancing down at me still sitting on the floor and chuckling to themselves. This scenario played out dozens of times throughout my childhood. The crawling, the begging, the humiliation followed by scraps that barely qualified as food. Sometimes I'd get a few bites of leftover vegetables that had grown cold and unappetizing. Other times, they'd give me water with a few crackers, telling me it was a soup course and that I should be grateful for their creativity. School became my refuge, not because teachers necessarily noticed what was happening, but because it was the only place where I could count on regular meals. I qualified for the free lunch program, though my parents told the school this was due to a temporary financial hardship rather than admitting the truth. Those school lunches became the highlight of my day. I'd eat every single bite, sometimes asking for seconds when they were available, storing up nutrition for the long stretches at home when food would be scarce. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, occasionally noticed that I seemed particularly hungry or tired, but my parents had coached me well on what to say if anyone asked questions. I was instructed to explain that we ate dinner very early at home, or that I was just a growing boy with a big appetite. The few times Mrs. Rodriguez probed deeper, asking if everything was okay at home, I'd recite the responses my parents had drilled into me about how lucky I was to have such caring parents who were teaching me important life lessons. The isolation was perhaps the most damaging aspect of the entire experience. My parents were careful to maintain their public image as devoted caregivers. When neighbors or friends visited, they'd make sure I was well fed and appeared happy. They'd even make comments about what a good eater I was, how they could barely keep up with my appetite, painting a picture of a household where food was abundant and freely given. During these public performances, they'd ruffle my hair affectionately and ask if I wanted more snacks, knowing I'd been trained to politely decline even when desperately hungry. If I ever showed signs of accepting food too eagerly in front of others, I'd face severe consequences later when we were alone. The physical effects of chronic undernourishment became increasingly apparent as I grew older. I was significantly smaller than other children my age, my clothes hung loose on my thin frame, and I often felt dizzy or weak during physical activities at school. When concerned adults asked about my size, my parents had ready explanations about genetics, late bloomers in the family, or my supposed picky eating habits that they were patiently trying to correct. My parents also became experts at manipulating medical appointments. During routine checkups, they'd feed me normally for several days beforehand to ensure my weight didn't raise immediate red flags. They'd coach me on how to describe my eating habits to the doctor, emphasizing that I was healthy and active, just naturally small for my age. Any questions about my home life were met with rehearsed answers about how much I loved spending time with my family and how well we all got along. The psychological conditioning ran deep. I began to internalize their messages that I didn't deserve, regular meals, that food was something to be earned rather than a basic necessity. When other kids at school complained about being hungry between meals, I felt confused by their expectations. In my world, hunger was normal, and eating was a privilege that had to be carefully negotiated. I developed elaborate fantasies about food, spending hours imagining what it would be like to open a refrigerator and take whatever I wanted without permission. I'd dream about birthday parties with unlimited cake, or holiday dinners where I could eat until I was truly full, instead of stopping when my tiny portion was finished. These daydreams became so vivid that sometimes I'd wake up disappointed to find myself back in my real bedroom, knowing that breakfast was hours away and might not come at all depending on my parents' mood. The social aspects of childhood became increasingly difficult to navigate. Birthday parties were torture because I'd never experienced the casual abundance of food that other families took for granted. When friends invited me for sleepovers, I'd have to decline because my parents said I had special dietary needs that other families wouldn't understand. The few times I did attend social gatherings, I'd often embarrass myself by eating too quickly or asking for seconds in ways that other children found strange. My academic performance suffered as my malnutrition worsened. Concentrating in class became nearly impossible when my stomach was constantly aching with hunger. I'd stare at the clock, counting minutes until lunch, sometimes feeling so weak that I'd put my head down on my desk and close my eyes, pretending to think while actually fighting off waves of dizziness. Other children began to notice that something was different about me, though they couldn't quite identify what it was. I was quieter than most kids, more withdrawn, and I had an intensity around food that made them uncomfortable. During lunch, I'd eat with a focus and desperation that other children found off-putting. They'd make jokes about me inhaling my food or acting like I'd never seen a sandwich before. The irony was that my parents seemed to genuinely enjoy their role as my tormentors. They'd discuss my lessons with each other as if they were pioneering a new form of character development. My father would tell my mother about how much more respectful I'd become since they'd started teaching me about gratitude. My mother would praise my father for his creative approach to discipline, saying that traditional timeout methods were too soft for modern children. They documented my humiliation with the methodical approach of researchers conducting an experiment. Beyond the phone recordings they made during my crawling sessions, they kept a written log of my progress, noting which punishments seemed most effective and which ones needed to be escalated. They treated my suffering like a fascinating case study rather than the systematic abuse of their own child. What I didn't know during those dark years was that someone was watching. Mrs. Eleanor Henderson lived in the house directly behind ours, and her kitchen window provided a clear view into our back door and the portion of our kitchen where most of my humiliation took place. Mrs. Henderson was a retired social worker in her 70s who had moved to our neighborhood after her husband passed away. She kept to herself mostly, but she was naturally observant, a habit developed over decades of professional training to notice things that others might miss. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The first time Mrs. Henderson witnessed one of my crawling episodes, she thought she must have misunderstood what she was seeing. Through her window, she watched as I got down on all fours and moved across the kitchen floor while my parents stood over me, clearly amused by whatever was happening. She assumed it must be some kind of game, perhaps a silly family tradition or a playful moment between parents and child. But as weeks passed and she continued to observe similar scenes, Mrs. Henderson began to realize that what she was witnessing wasn't playful at all. She noticed that these episodes always seemed to occur around mealtimes, and that I appeared to be pleading or begging for something while my parents remained standing, often holding plates of food just out of my reach. Mrs. Henderson had installed a comprehensive security system around her property after a series of break-ins in the neighborhood the previous year. One of her cameras, positioned to monitor her back garden, inadvertently captured a clear view of our kitchen through the large window that my parents had never thought to cover during daylight hours. The camera was motion-activated and high-definition, capable of recording both video and audio when subjects were close enough to the property line. For several months, Mrs. Henderson wrestled with what she was seeing. Her professional experience told her that something was seriously wrong, but the respectability of my parents in the community made her question her own perceptions. My father was known as a reliable man who helped neighbors with insurance claims, and my mother was beloved at the library for her patience with difficult patrons. They attended church regularly, volunteered for community events, and maintained an immaculate property that was the envy of the neighborhood. The turning point came on a cold February evening when Mrs. Henderson witnessed what she later described as the most disturbing scene of her entire career in social work. Through her camera footage, she watched as my parents forced me to crawl in circles around the kitchen island for nearly 20 minutes while they ate dinner, making me earn each bite by performing increasingly degrading acts. The audio picked up their laughter and cruel commentary about my desperation, along with my quiet sobs as I complied with their demands. That night, Mrs. Henderson made the decision that would ultimately save my life. She began systematically reviewing and organizing all the footage her security system had captured over the previous months, creating a comprehensive archive of evidence that documented the pattern of abuse happening in the house behind hers. She spent weeks going through hundreds of hours of recordings, identifying the most damaging clips, and creating a timeline that showed how the abuse had escalated over time. What Mrs. Henderson discovered in those recordings was far worse than even she had initially suspected. The footage revealed a systematic campaign of psychological torture that had been carefully planned and executed by two adults who seemed to derive genuine pleasure from their child's suffering. The recordings captured not just the crawling incidents, but also moments when my parents would taunt me with food, discuss their strategies for breaking my spirit, and celebrate their success in reducing me to a state of complete submission. But I knew none of this was happening. In my daily life, I continued to endure the cycle of hunger, humiliation, and brief reprieves that had become my normal existence. I had no idea that someone was watching, documenting, and preparing to intervene. I had no concept that what was happening to me was not only wrong, but criminal, and that there were people in the world who would fight to protect children like me if they only knew the truth. The winter of my 8th year was particularly brutal. My parents had grown more creative in their punishments, and food became even more scarce as they decided I needed to learn about real hunger to appreciate what I had. There were days when I'd go to school having not eaten anything for over 24 hours, surviving on water and the few crackers I could sometimes sneak from the pantry when they weren't watching. During this time, I began to notice Mrs. Henderson more frequently. She'd be working in her garden when I walked to the school bus, and she'd wave at me with a kind smile that seemed different from the way other adults looked at me. Sometimes she'd be outside when I returned from school, and she'd call out friendly greetings that felt genuine rather than obligatory. I didn't think much of it at the time, but there was something in her eyes that seemed to see me in a way that others didn't. What I couldn't have known was that Mrs. Henderson was conducting her own investigation, cross-referencing the times, when she witnessed abuse with school records, medical appointments, and other documentation that might support what her cameras had captured. She was building a case with the thoroughness of someone who understood that accusations against seemingly respectable parents would require overwhelming evidence to be taken seriously. The abuse wasn't limited to food deprivation. My parents had developed an entire philosophy around what they called teaching resilience through adversity. This meant that beyond the hunger, I was subjected to emotional manipulation designed to convince me that I deserved every bit of suffering they inflicted. They'd explain in calm, rational voices that other parents were too soft, too permissive, and that their tough love was actually a gift that would make me stronger than other children. They'd compare me unfavorably to fictional children who faced greater hardships, telling me stories about kids who walked miles for clean water or worked in factories to support their families. According to their twisted logic, my situation was actually privileged because I had a roof over my head and attended school regularly. The food deprivation was simply character building, no different from athletes who trained through discomfort to achieve greatness. This narrative was reinforced constantly. During the rare moments when they did allow me to eat normally, they'd remind me how generous they were being and how grateful I should feel for their kindness. They'd make me thank them extensively for each bite, expressing appreciation not just for the food, but for the lesson in humility that came with having to earn it. The crawling ritual became their favorite form of entertainment. They'd invite me to perform for my dinner, setting up elaborate scenarios where I'd have to navigate obstacle courses they'd created with kitchen chairs and household items. Sometimes they'd put food at the end of the course and make me crawl through their maze while they timed me with a stopwatch, betting on whether I'd complete the challenge within their arbitrary time limits. Other times, they'd make me crawl to different stations around the house, requiring me to complete tasks. At each location before moving to the next, I might have to crawl to the living room and recite multiplication tables, then crawl to the bathroom and clean the toilet, then crawl back to the kitchen where they'd evaluate whether my performance had been worthy of a small snack. The recording sessions became more frequent as they grew more confident in their methods. They'd position their phones to capture different angles of my crawling, sometimes directing me to move slower so they could get better footage, or asking me to repeat particularly humiliating moments because the first recording hadn't captured their favorite parts clearly enough. They created a digital library of my degradation, storing videos on multiple devices and occasionally showing clips to each other during quiet evenings when they wanted entertainment. They'd critique my performances like film directors, discussing which angles worked best and planning new scenarios for future sessions. The physical deterioration was becoming harder to hide. My clothes, which had never fit properly due to my small size, now hung on me like garments meant for a much larger person. My face had taken on a gaunt appearance that made me look older than my 8 years, with dark circles under my eyes that couldn't be explained away by normal childhood tiredness. At school, I'd begun falling asleep during lessons, my body shutting down to conserve the little energy I had. When teachers asked if I was getting enough sleep at home, I'd explain that I was a night owl who loved staying up late reading, another lie my parents had taught me to deflect concern about my condition. The social worker visits that my parents had always feared never materialized, because no one at school had reason to suspect systematic abuse. I was polite, quiet, and generally well-behaved. My academic performance, while declining, wasn't poor enough to trigger intervention protocols. Most importantly, I was skilled at hiding the truth, having been trained from an early age to protect my parents' reputation at all costs. My parents had convinced me that if anyone ever discovered what was happening at home, I'd be taken away and placed in foster care where things would be much worse. They'd describe foster homes as places where children were truly mistreated, where abuse was random and unpredictable rather than the structured learning environment they provided. According to them, I was lucky to have parents who cared enough to teach me difficult lessons rather than abandoning me to strangers who wouldn't invest in my character development. This fear of the unknown kept me compliant, even when the abuse reached levels that my young mind recognized as extreme. I'd rather endure the familiar pain of my parents' cruelty than risk the imagined horrors of foster care that they'd painted in such vivid detail. They'd reinforced this fear by pointing out news stories about children who'd been harmed in the foster system, using these tragic cases as evidence that staying with them was my safest option. But Mrs. Henderson was building a different kind of safety net, one that I couldn't see but that was growing stronger every day. Her camera system had captured not just individual incidents of abuse, but a comprehensive pattern that showed the systematic nature of what was happening to me. The footage revealed the calculated cruelty of my parents' actions and provided evidence that would be impossible to dismiss or explain away. As winter turned to spring in my 9th year, the abuse reached a crescendo that would ultimately trigger the intervention I never knew was coming. My parents had grown so comfortable with their control over me that they'd become careless about hiding their activities, never suspecting that their neighbor's security system was creating an archive that would eventually expose every cruel detail of what they'd done to their own child. The hidden camera footage that Mrs. Henderson had been collecting was about to shatter the carefully constructed facade that my parents had spent years building, revealing the truth about what happened when no one was supposed to be watching. The spring of my 9th year brought changes that I couldn't have anticipated. Mrs. Henderson had been methodically preparing her case, but she knew that approaching Authorities without ironclad evidence would likely result in my parents being warned and becoming more careful about hiding their abuse. She needed to time her intervention perfectly. During this period, my parents introduced new forms of psychological torture that went beyond simple food deprivation. They began what they called gratitude exercises, where I was required to write thank you letters to them for their parenting methods. These letters had to be detailed and convincing, expressing appreciation for being taught discipline and resilience through hunger. Dear Mom and Dad, I'd write in my careful 9-year-old handwriting, thank you for helping me learn that food is not something to take for granted. I understand now that other kids are spoiled and don't appreciate what they have. I'm grateful that you care enough about me to teach me these important lessons about life. My parents would review these letters like literary critics, pointing out sections that weren't enthusiastic enough, or demanding rewrites when my gratitude didn't sound sufficiently genuine. They'd keep the letters in a folder, occasionally reading their favorites aloud during dinner while I sat with my empty plate, forcing me to listen to my own coerced words praising their cruelty. The neighbors began to play an increasingly important role in maintaining my parents' facade. The Williamson family next door had a daughter named Sarah who was my age, and my parents would sometimes arrange play dates that served as opportunities to demonstrate their supposed parenting excellence. During these visits, they'd prepare elaborate snacks and encourage me to eat freely, creating the impression that our household was abundant with both food and affection. Marcus, honey, would you like another sandwich? My mother would ask sweetly while Sarah's mother watched approvingly. I swear this boy never stops eating. We can barely keep the refrigerator stocked. These performances were carefully orchestrated theater. My parents would spend days before each playdate ensuring I was well fed and coached on how to behave naturally around food. They'd warn me that any deviation from the script would result in severe consequences once the guests left, and they'd promise extended periods without food if I gave any indication that eating freely wasn't my normal experience. Sarah's mother, Linda Williamson, would often comment on what a polite and well-mannered child I was, praising my parents for raising such a respectful son. She'd marvel at how I always asked permission before taking snacks and how grateful I seemed for everything offered to me. What she interpreted as exceptional manners was actually the result of conditioning that had taught me to view every bite of food as a privilege that could be revoked at any moment. The school year progressed with me maintaining my carefully constructed mask of normalcy. I'd learned to manage my energy throughout the day, conserving strength for essential activities, and finding ways to rest without appearing obviously unwell. During recess, while other children played actively, I'd often sit quietly and watch, telling teachers that I preferred observing to participating in games. My teacher, Mrs. Rodriguez, continued to notice subtle signs that something wasn't quite right, but my parents had become increasingly sophisticated in their deception. They'd begun sending me to school with small snacks that I was instructed to eat publicly, creating witnesses to my apparent well-being. These snacks were carefully calculated to be visible to teachers while providing minimal actual nutrition. Look, Mrs. Rodriguez, I'd say, pulling out a small bag of crackers during morning break. My mom packed extra snacks because she says I'm growing so fast. The lie came easily after months of practice, and it served its purpose of reinforcing the narrative that my parents were attentive caregivers, concerned about my nutritional needs. But Mrs. Henderson's investigation was reaching a critical phase. She had identified patterns in the abuse that corresponded with specific triggers, noting that my parents' cruelty often intensified during stressful periods in their own lives. When my father had difficult days at work, or my mother felt overwhelmed with library duties, they'd take out their frustrations through increasingly severe food restrictions and more elaborate humiliation rituals. The footage had captured conversations between my parents that revealed the calculated nature of their abuse. In one particularly damning recording, my mother could be heard explaining to my father how they needed to vary their punishment methods to prevent me from becoming too accustomed to any single form of suffering. They discussed my psychological state with the clinical detachment of researchers studying an experimental subject. "He's getting too comfortable with the crawling," my mother's voice said clearly on the recording. "We need to escalate things or he'll stop taking it seriously." "What if we make him crawl outside?" my father suggested. "The concrete patio would be more uncomfortable than the kitchen tile." "Perfect," my mother agreed. "And we can invite the neighbors to watch if anyone happens to be outside. That'll add an extra layer of humiliation." Mrs. Henderson played this conversation multiple times, ensuring she understood every word correctly. The casual way my parents discussed escalating my suffering while planning to potentially involve unwitting neighbors in their cruelty convinced her that immediate action was necessary. The outdoor crawling sessions began in early March. My parents would force me to crawl across our back patio, which was visible not only to Mrs. Henderson, but potentially to several other neighbors depending on their positions in their yards. The concrete was rough and cold, scraping my knees through my thin pants and leaving marks that I'd have to explain away at school as results of playground falls. During one of these outdoor sessions, Mrs. Henderson's camera captured footage that would become central to the legal case that was already being developed behind the scenes. The video showed me crawling in circles around a picnic table while my parents sat in lawn chairs, eating barbecue and drinking beer as if watching their child's degradation was the perfect accompaniment to their meal. "Faster, Marcus," my father's voice carried clearly across the yards. "The chicken's getting cold while you're taking your sweet time out there." "Maybe if he barked a little, it would be more entertaining," my mother suggested, and both of them erupted into laughter that the sensitive microphones picked up perfectly. The footage showed me stopping mid-crawl, looking up at them with an expression of confusion and pain that was heartbreaking in its innocence. I was still just a child, trying to understand why the people who were supposed to love me most found my suffering so amusing. "I'm trying my best," I said, in a small voice that barely registered on the recording equipment. "Your best isn't good." "Enough," my father replied, his tone shifting from amused to cold. "Maybe you're not hungry enough yet. Go inside and wait until tomorrow." The camera followed my small figure as I stood up slowly, my legs shaking from the prolonged crawling, and walked into the house with my head down. My parents remained outside, continuing their meal and discussing whether they should make outdoor crawling a regular part of my routine now that the weather was improving. Mrs. Henderson had seen enough. That evening, she contacted Child Protective Services and requested a meeting with the most senior investigator available. She explained that she had extensive video evidence of ongoing child abuse and that the situation was escalating in ways that put the child at immediate risk. The initial response from CPS was cautious. The Chen family had no previous reports or red flags in the system, and accusations against parents without prior history typically required substantial evidence to pursue. Mrs. Henderson was told that she could file a report, but that investigation protocols would likely begin with interviews and home visits that could alert the parents to the complaint. Mrs. Henderson understood the limitations of the system, but she also knew that her evidence was extraordinary. She requested a meeting where she could present the footage directly to investigators, arguing that the severity and systematic nature of what she'd captured warranted immediate intervention rather than the standard gradual approach. The meeting was scheduled for the following week, giving Mrs. Henderson time to prepare a comprehensive presentation of her evidence. She organized the footage chronologically, creating a timeline that showed how the abuse had evolved and intensified over months. She prepared written summaries of key incidents, transcripts of the most damaging audio recordings, and expert analysis of my physical decline as visible in the footage over time. Meanwhile, completely unaware of the investigation building around them, my parents continued their routine. They'd grown so confident in their methods that they'd begun discussing the possibility of writing a book about their parenting philosophy. They believed they'd discovered revolutionary techniques for raising children who would be tougher and more resilient than their spoiled peers. "We should document our methods more systematically," my mother suggested during one of their evening planning sessions. "Other parents would pay good money to learn how to raise kids with real character." instead of these entitled brats you see everywhere. My father was enthusiastic about the idea. We could call it Earning Everything: How Tough Love Creates Strong Children. Marcus could be our case study, showing how our methods transformed him from a typical spoiled kid into someone with real appreciation for what he has. These conversations, captured clearly on Mrs. Henderson's audio equipment, would later serve as devastating evidence of premeditation and the complete absence of parental concern for my well-being. The recordings showed that my parents viewed me not as their child to love and protect, but as a subject for their experimental parenting methods and a potential source of profit through their planned book. The week leading up to Mrs. Henderson's meeting with Child Protective Services coincided with one of the worst periods of abuse I'd experienced. My parents had decided that I'd become too comfortable with their routine and needed what they called a reset. This meant 3 consecutive days with no food at all, followed by increasingly elaborate crawling performances before I'd be allowed, tiny portions that barely sustained life. During this period, I began experiencing symptoms that should have alarmed any caring parent. I was having difficulty staying awake during the day, my hands shook when I tried to write, and I'd developed a persistent cough that my parents dismissed as attention-seeking behavior. When I told them I felt dizzy and weak, they accused me of being dramatic and prescribed additional crawling exercises as treatment for my supposed laziness. The final incident that Mrs. Henderson captured before her meeting with authorities was so disturbing that she later said it convinced her that waiting even one more day could put my life at risk. The footage showed my parents forcing me to crawl outside during a cold rain, making me circle our patio repeatedly while they watched from the covered porch, warm and dry. I was soaked within minutes, my thin clothes offering no protection against the cold spring rain. My parents found my shivering amusing, commenting that the discomfort would help me appreciate being warm and dry in the future. When I slipped on the wet concrete and fell, scraping my palms and knees, they laughed and told me to be more careful. "Get up and keep going," my mother called out. "Rain never hurt anyone, and you need to learn that comfort is earned, not given." The footage showed me struggling to get back on my hands and knees, my small body shaking from both cold and exhaustion. The camera captured the moment when I looked directly toward Mrs. Henderson's house, though I had no idea I was being recorded. The expression on my face was one of complete hopelessness, the look of a child who had given up believing that anyone would ever help him. That night, Mrs. Henderson called the emergency line for Child Protective Services, explaining that she had evidence of abuse that was escalating and that the child appeared to be in immediate danger. She was told that emergency protocols would be activated and that investigators would review her evidence first thing Monday morning. The weekend that followed was surreal in its normalcy. My parents, having no idea that their world was about to collapse, continued their routine as if nothing had changed. They forced me through another outdoor crawling session on Saturday, this time making me navigate around lawn furniture while they hosted a barbecue for themselves, eating burgers and hot dogs while I performed my humiliating routine mere feet away. Sunday brought what would be the final crawling session I'd ever endure under their roof. My parents had decided to celebrate what they considered a successful week of discipline by making me crawl through the entire house, from room to room, while they followed behind eating ice cream and critiquing my technique. "Your form is getting sloppy," my father observed as I moved across the living room carpet. "Remember, this is supposed to be training, not just going through the motions." "Maybe he needs more motivation," my mother suggested. "What if we put food in each room and make him choose which one he wants most? Then he only gets to eat from one room, so he has to crawl to all of them before deciding." They implemented this twisted game immediately, placing different snacks in various rooms throughout the house and forcing me to crawl to each location to examine my options before making a choice. The humiliation of having to evaluate food like a trained animal while my parents followed behind, commenting on my decision-making process and second-guessing my choices, was captured in detail by the multiple cameras Mrs. Henderson had strategically positioned. What made this final session particularly cruel was that after forcing me to crawl to 5 different rooms and examine the food options, my parents announced that it had all been a test of my self-control, and that choosing any of the food would prove I was still too greedy and impulsive to deserve eating that day. I'd crawled through the entire house, endured their commentary and laughter, and performed their degrading ritual perfectly, only to be told that the real lesson was learning to refuse food even when it was offered. The footage of this incident would later be described by prosecutors as evidence of psychological torture designed to break down a child's sense of reality and self-worth. The systematic nature of the abuse, combined with the clear enjoyment my parents derived from my suffering, would form the foundation of criminal charges that would ultimately send them to prison. But as Sunday evening ended and I fell asleep, on my bedroom floor, my parents had removed my mattress as part of their escalating punishments. I had no idea that Mrs. Henderson was making final preparations for a presentation that would change everything. She spent the night organizing her evidence into a comprehensive package that documented not just individual incidents, but a pattern of systematic abuse that had been escalating toward what she feared could become a tragic conclusion. Monday. Morning arrived with the deceptive calm that often precedes life-altering events. My parents sent me to school as usual, warning me that they'd planned special exercises for when I returned home. Exercises that would test whether I'd learned anything from my weekend lessons. They seemed particularly excited about whatever they had planned, discussing logistics in whispers and making preparations that involved moving furniture in ways that suggested they were creating a new performance space for my humiliation. At school, I went through the motions of a normal day, unaware that several miles away, Mrs. Henderson was presenting evidence that would expose the truth about my home life to people who had the power to intervene. The footage she'd captured was about to shatter the illusion of the perfect Chen family and reveal the systematic torture that had been hidden behind our suburban facade. The investigation that would ultimately save my life was beginning, but the most dramatic confrontations were still ahead. My parents had no idea that their neighbor had been documenting their crimes, and I had no idea that rescue was finally coming. The hidden camera footage that had captured months of abuse was about to become the key evidence in a case that would shock our entire community and prove that sometimes the most horrific cruelty happens behind the closed doors of houses that look exactly like everyone else's. As I sat in Mrs. Rodriguez's classroom that Monday morning, struggling to focus on math problems while my empty stomach cramped with hunger, the wheels of justice were finally beginning to turn. The evidence that Mrs. Henderson had painstakingly collected was about to trigger a chain of events that would expose my parents' crimes and begin my journey toward a life where food wasn't a weapon and love wasn't conditional on degradation. But before that rescue could happen, there would be one final confrontation that would test whether I could survive long enough for help to arrive. My parents had planned something special for that afternoon, something they'd been building toward for weeks, and Mrs. Henderson's cameras were positioned to capture every devastating moment of what they intended to be their masterpiece of psychological destruction. The hours between my morning departure for school and my afternoon return home would prove to be the most crucial in determining whether Mrs. Henderson's intervention would come in time to prevent irreversible damage. The hidden camera footage had documented the escalation of abuse over months, but the events about to unfold would provide the final, undeniable evidence that would ensure my parents could never hurt another child again. As the school day progressed, and I tried to concentrate on lessons while my body weakened from lack of nutrition, investigators were reviewing footage that would soon change everything. The evidence was overwhelming, the crimes were clear, and the intervention was imminent. The only question remaining was whether I could endure whatever my parents had planned for that afternoon long enough for help to finally arrive. The contrast between my parents' confidence in their control and the reality of the investigation closing in around them would soon create a collision that would expose the truth about what had been happening behind our suburban facade. The hidden cameras had captured more than just isolated incidents of abuse. They'd documented a systematic campaign of torture that had been escalating toward a conclusion that Mrs. Henderson feared might prove fatal if left unchecked. That Monday afternoon, as I walked home from the school bus stop, I had no idea I was walking toward the final chapter of my captivity. My parents were waiting with their most elaborate plan yet, completely unaware that every moment was being recorded and that their neighbor had already set in motion the intervention that would end their reign of terror forever. The hidden camera. Footage had provided the evidence needed to save my life, but the dramatic confrontation that was about to unfold would test whether that salvation would arrive in time to prevent the irreversible damage my parents were planning to inflict. The community that had seen us as the perfect family was about to discover the horrific truth that had been hidden in plain sight, and the consequences would shatter more than just my parents' carefully constructed facade. Everything was about to change, but first I had to survive whatever my parents had planned for that afternoon. The evidence was already in the hands of authorities, the investigation was underway, and rescue was coming. But would it arrive before my parents crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed? The hidden camera footage had captured the escalation toward this moment, and soon, it would capture either my rescue or my final destruction at the hands of the people who were supposed to protect me above all else. Monday afternoon, 3:47 p.m. I remember the exact time because I was staring at the kitchen clock when I walked through our back door, trying to calculate how many hours it had been since my last meal. 31 hours. My parents were waiting for me with expressions I'd never seen before, a mixture of excitement and anticipation that made my blood run cold. "Marcus, sweetie," my mother said in her fake sweet voice, "we have something very special planned for today. We've been talking about your progress, and we think you're ready for advanced training." The living room had been completely rearranged. All the furniture had been pushed against the walls, creating a large open space in the center. Scattered across the floor were various household items, kitchen utensils, books, toys I hadn't been allowed to touch in months, and most disturbingly, several bowls of different foods placed at seemingly random intervals. "Today's lesson is about choices and consequences," my father explained, his voice carrying a tone of mock seriousness that I'd learned to fear. "You're going to crawl to each bowl and taste what's inside, but here's the catch: some of the bowls contain real food, and some contain things that aren't meant to be eaten. You have to figure out which is which." My stomach dropped as I looked more closely at the bowls. Even from a distance, I could see that some contained what appeared to be normal foods like crackers or fruit pieces, while others held substances that looked questionable. Dog food, what might have been soap shavings, or dark liquids I couldn't identify. "If you choose wrong," my mother continued, "you don't eat anything today. If you choose right, you get to finish whatever's in that bowl. But you can only choose 3 bowls total, and you have to crawl to each one and taste it before deciding whether to continue eating from it." This was a new level of cruelty that went beyond their previous methods. They weren't just withholding food or making me humiliate myself to earn it. They were turning eating itself into a dangerous game where making the wrong choice could mean consuming something harmful or losing the opportunity to eat entirely. What I didn't know was that Mrs. Henderson had spent her Monday morning in a conference room at the Child Protective Services office, presenting her evidence to a team of investigators, prosecutors, and child welfare specialists. The footage she'd captured had shocked experienced professionals who thought they'd seen every form of child abuse imaginable. Detective Sarah Morales, a specialist in child abuse cases, had been reviewing Mrs. Henderson's evidence since early morning. The systematic nature of the abuse, combined with the clear audio recordings of my parents planning escalating punishments, had convinced her that immediate intervention was necessary. A warrant for emergency removal had been approved, and a team was being assembled to execute it that very afternoon. "The psychological manipulation here is as severe as any physical abuse case I've worked," Detective Morales explained to her team. "These parents have created a systematic torture program designed to break down this child's sense of self-worth and reality. The escalation pattern suggests they're building toward something that could cause permanent psychological damage or worse. The team reviewing Mrs. Henderson's evidence included Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a child psychologist who specialized in cases of severe neglect and abuse. Dr. Walsh had identified patterns in the footage that indicated sophisticated psychological manipulation, techniques typically seen only in cases involving adult perpetrators with extensive experience in breaking down victims' resistance. What we're seeing here isn't typical parental cruelty, Dr. Walsh explained. This is systematic psychological torture using food as the primary weapon. The parents have created a comprehensive program designed to destroy this child's sense of agency and self-worth while maintaining plausible deniability about their methods. Back in our living room, I was facing the twisted game my parents had designed. The rules were simple, but terrifying. Crawl to 3 different bowls, taste the contents of each, and decide whether to continue eating from that bowl or move on to the next choice. Choose wrong and risk poisoning myself or losing the opportunity to eat anything. Choose right and maybe get enough nutrition to survive another day. I dropped to my hands and knees and began crawling toward the nearest bowl. The hardwood floor was cold against my palms, and my knees immediately began aching from the pressure. My parents positioned themselves on the couch like judges at a competition, my mother holding her phone to record my performance while my father kept score on a notepad. The first bowl contained what appeared to be chicken nuggets, but when I tasted one, the flavor was wrong. Too salty and with a chemical aftertaste that made me gag. I realized they'd likely soaked regular nuggets in cleaning solution or some other household chemical to make them inedible while maintaining their appearance. Interesting choice, my father commented. Are you going to finish those or move on to bowl number 2? I spat out the contaminated nugget and crawled toward the second bowl, my parents' laughter following me across the room. This bowl contained what looked like chocolate pudding, but I'd learned to be suspicious of anything that seemed too good to be true. I dipped my finger in cautiously and tasted it. It was actually chocolate pudding, real and untampered with. Smart boy, my mother said approvingly. But remember, you can only choose 3 bowls total. Are you sure you want to waste one of your choices on such a small portion? The psychological pressure was immense. The pudding bowl contained maybe 4 tablespoons of food, barely a snack, let alone a meal. But it was real food, and I was so hungry that even this small amount felt precious. I had to decide whether to eat it and use up one of my 3 choices, or gamble that I could find something more substantial in one of the remaining bowls. I chose to eat the pudding, savoring each tiny spoonful while my parents provided commentary, like sports announcers calling a game. They discussed my technique, my desperation level, and their predictions about my remaining choices as if my survival was entertainment designed for their amusement. Look how slowly he's eating, my mother observed. He knows this might be all he gets today. The question is whether he's learned enough self-control to save some for later, or if he'll devour it all like an animal, my father added. I finished every bit of the pudding and crawled toward my second choice. This bowl contained what appeared to be crackers, but when I picked one up, I noticed they felt unusually heavy and had a strange texture. I bit into one carefully and immediately realized they'd mixed something gritty into the crackers, possibly sand or another inedible substance designed to make them unpalatable while maintaining their appearance. 2 choices down, 1 remaining. I'd managed to consume about 4 tablespoons of pudding, which did almost nothing to address the hunger that had been building for over 30 hours. My final choice would determine whether I'd have any real sustenance, or if this entire degrading performance would leave me still starving. The remaining bowls were scattered across the far side of the room, requiring me to crawl past my parents' feet to reach them. As I moved across the floor, my mother deliberately shifted her position so I'd have to crawl around her legs, adding an extra layer of humiliation to an already degrading situation. "Excuse me," I whispered as I navigated around her feet. "No talking during the exercise," my father said sharply. "This is supposed to be training in focus and determination, not social hour." The third bowl I chose contained what appeared to be apple slices, and when I tasted one, it seemed normal. But after eating 2 pieces, I realized they'd been treated with something that left a bitter aftertaste and made my tongue feel slightly numb. Whether this was a cleaning product, medication, or some other household chemical, I couldn't tell. But I knew continuing to eat them could make me sick. "Time's up," my father announced. "3 choices made, and what did you end up with? A tiny bit of pudding and 2 pieces of doctored apple. That's what happens when you make impulsive decisions instead of thinking strategically." My mother was reviewing the footage she'd captured on her phone, replaying moments where I'd looked particularly desperate or confused. "This one's definitely going in the highlight reel," she said, showing my father a clip of me gagging on the contaminated nuggets. "We should make this a weekly tradition," my father suggested. "Maybe next time we'll make it even more challenging." By blindfolding him so he has to identify foods by taste alone, they were already planning future torments, treating my suffering like a hobby they wanted to develop and refine. The casual way they discussed escalating my abuse while I sat on the floor, still hungry and now slightly poisoned by whatever they'd put in the food, showed how completely they'd lost any sense of me as their child rather than their victim. What none of us knew was that at that exact moment, Detective Morales was reviewing the final pieces of evidence needed for the emergency intervention. Mrs. Henderson's footage had provided prosecutors with what they called a slam dunk case, but they wanted to ensure that the timing of the arrest would maximize the safety of the child, while minimizing the parent's opportunity to destroy evidence or flee. The decision was made to execute the warrant that evening, during what investigators had identified as the family's typical dinner time based on patterns observed in the surveillance footage. This would allow them to catch my parents in their normal environment while ensuring that I was present and could be immediately removed from the home. Mrs. Henderson had volunteered to be present during the arrest to provide continuity for me, understanding that I'd likely be confused and frightened by the sudden appearance of strangers claiming to be there to help. She'd prepared age-appropriate explanations for what was happening and why, drawing on her decades of experience helping children navigate traumatic transitions. As evening approached, my parents began preparing for what they called dinner theater, another session where they'd eat a full meal while making me perform increasingly elaborate routines to earn tiny scraps. They'd grown so comfortable with their cruelty that they'd begun inviting creativity into their abuse, designing new forms of humiliation, like artists working on their masterpiece. "Tonight, we're going to try something different," my mother announced as she set the table for 2. "Marcus, you're going to be our entertainment while we eat. We want you to crawl around the table and tell us a story about a little boy who learns to appreciate food. Make it interesting, because if we get bored, you don't get anything." They positioned their phones to record from multiple angles, planning to capture what they hoped would be their most creative session yet. My father had even prepared a scorecard system where they'd rate my storytelling performance and determine my food allocation based on how well I managed to entertain them while crawling. At 6:15 p.m., as my parents were putting the finishing touches on their elaborate dinner and I was mentally preparing for another evening of degradation, Detective Morales and her team were conducting their final briefing in the parking lot of our local police station. The intervention team included 2 detectives, a child protective services specialist, a paramedic trained in malnutrition assessment, and Mrs. Henderson as a civilian witness. "Remember, our primary goal is the immediate safety of the child," Detective Morales reminded her team. "Secondary goals are preserving evidence and ensuring the parents can't claim ignorance about the severity of their actions. The footage we've reviewed shows systematic abuse, so we need to be prepared for potential resistance and denial." The paramedic, James Mitchell, had reviewed Mrs. Henderson's footage with particular attention to my physical condition over time. "The child shows clear signs of chronic malnutrition and possible dehydration," he reported. "We need to be prepared for immediate medical intervention and potential hospitalization, depending on his condition when we arrive." At 6:23 p.m., I was beginning my storytelling performance, crawling slowly around our dining room table while my parents ate roast beef and mashed potatoes. I was inventing a tale about a grateful little boy who learned important lessons about appreciating food, my voice weak from hunger but steady from months of practice at performing under pressure. Once upon a time, I began, my knees already aching against the hardwood floor, there was a little boy who thought he deserved to eat whenever he was hungry. At 6:24 p.m., Detective Morales knocked on our front door. The sound echoed through our house like a gunshot, stopping my story mid-sentence and causing my parents to freeze with forks halfway to their mouths. Nobody ever knocked on our door during dinner time. Our neighbors knew better than to interrupt the Chen family's evening routine, and we weren't expecting any deliveries or visitors. "Get up and go to your room," my father hissed at me, his voice tight with sudden anxiety. "Don't make a sound." I scrambled to my feet and headed toward the stairs, but my mother grabbed my arm before I could leave the room. "Actually, stay here," she whispered, "but sit on the floor by the wall and don't move." My parents approached the front door together, quickly scanning the dining room to ensure there was no obvious evidence of what had been happening. The bowls from their elaborate game that afternoon had been cleaned and put away, and they'd removed my empty plate from the table before starting their dinner. Through the front window, they could see several official-looking vehicles parked on our street and uniformed officers positioned around our property. My father's face went pale as he realized this wasn't a routine visit or a case of mistaken identity. "Richard and Patricia Chen?" Detective Morales asked when my father opened the door. "I'm Detective Morales with the County Sheriff's Department. We have a warrant to enter your home and speak with your son Marcus regarding allegations of child abuse." The words hit our living room like a bomb. My mother's composure cracked immediately, her face cycling through confusion, fear, and desperate calculation as she tried to process what was happening. My father attempted to maintain his insurance adjuster's calm professionalism, but his hands were visibly shaking as he examined the warrant. "I think there's been some kind of mistake," my father said, his voice artificially steady. "We're a normal family. Marcus is a healthy, happy child. I don't know what allegations you're referring to, but I can assure you they're unfounded." "Sir, we need to come inside and speak with Marcus directly," Detective Morales replied firmly. "This is a lawful warrant, and we'll be entering your home now to ensure the child's safety." As the officers moved into our house, I remained frozen, against the dining room wall, trying to understand what was happening. The words child abuse and allegations were spinning in my head, but I couldn't connect them to my own situation. In my mind, what happened to me was just my family's way of doing things, different from other families but not necessarily wrong. Mrs. Henderson entered the house behind the officers, and when she saw me sitting small and thin against the wall, her professional composure nearly broke. The child she'd been watching through her security footage looked even more fragile in person, his clothes hanging loose on his undernourished frame, and his eyes holding a wariness that no 9-year-old should possess. "Hello, Marcus," she said gently, kneeling down to my eye level. "My name is Mrs. Henderson. I live in the house behind yours, and I've been worried about you. These nice people are here to make sure you're safe." I looked toward my parents, seeking guidance on how to respond, but they were both focused on the warrant and the growing number of officials filling our living room. The paramedic, James Mitchell, was already conducting a visual assessment of my condition, noting the obvious signs of malnutrition and the scrapes on my knees that were visible through my torn pants. "Marcus," Detective Morales said, approaching me with the careful movements of someone trained to interact with traumatized children. "Can you tell me about the last time you had something to eat?" The question seemed simple, but I'd been conditioned to be careful about how I discussed food with outsiders. My parents had drilled into me that our family's eating schedule was private information that other people wouldn't understand without proper context. "I had lunch at school today," I answered truthfully. though that had been 6 hours earlier and consisted of a small portion of cafeteria food that I'd eaten slowly to make it last as long as possible. "What about when you got home from school?" the detective continued. "Did your parents offer you a snack or dinner?" I glanced toward my parents again, seeing my mother's warning look that reminded me of all the consequences I'd face if I said the wrong thing. But there was something different about this situation that made their usual threats feel less immediate than they normally did. "We were doing an exercise," I said carefully, unsure how much truth I was allowed to tell. "What kind of exercise?" Detective Morales asked, her voice remaining gentle but becoming more focused. Before I could answer, my father interrupted. "Marcus has some behavioral issues that require structured discipline," he explained to the detective. "We use creative methods to help him learn self-control and appreciation for what he has. Everything we do is designed to help him become a better person." Detective Morales ignored my father and kept her attention focused on me. "Marcus, can you show me what kind of exercise you were doing when you got home today?" The room fell silent. I could feel my parents' eyes burning into me, could sense their desperate hope that I'd maintain the family's secrets, even in this unprecedented situation. But something about Detective Morales's voice and the way Mrs. Henderson was looking at me with such gentle concern made me feel like maybe, for the first time in my life, telling the truth might be safe. "They made me crawl around the living room and taste things from different bowls," I said quietly. "Some of the bowls had real food and some had bad things in them. I had to guess which ones were safe to eat." The effect of these words on the adults in the room was immediate and dramatic. Detective Morales's jaw tightened as she processed what I'd just described, while the paramedic moved closer to begin a more thorough assessment of my condition. Mrs. Henderson's eyes filled with tears, though she tried to hide her emotional response to protect my sense of safety. My parents realized immediately that their carefully constructed facade was crumbling. My mother began speaking rapidly, trying to reframe what I'd just revealed. "It's not what it sounds like," she said desperately. "We were teaching him about making good choices. All the bowls contained safe foods. We'd never put anything dangerous where he could reach it. It's just a creative way to help him learn about decision-making." But Detective Morales had already seen Mrs. Henderson's footage. She knew exactly what my parents had been doing, and she'd heard the audio recordings of them planning to escalate their abuse. My spontaneous description of the afternoon's events perfectly matched what investigators already knew about my parents' methods. "Mrs. Chen," Detective Morales said, her voice now carrying the authority of someone making an arrest, "you and your husband are under arrest for child abuse, child endangerment, and criminal neglect. You have the right to remain silent." The Miranda rights continued, but I stopped processing the words as I watched my parents being handcuffed in our living room. The scene felt surreal, like something from a television show rather than my actual life. These people who had controlled every aspect of my existence for years were suddenly powerless, being led away by strangers who treated them like criminals. My mother was crying, not from remorse but from anger and disbelief that their private, family matters were being treated as crimes. "You don't understand," she kept repeating to anyone who would listen. "We're good parents. We're teaching him values that other kids never learn. He's going to be stronger because of what we've done." Father remained silent, but his face showed the calculation of someone already planning his defense strategy. Even while being arrested, he was working through how to present their actions as misunderstood parenting, rather than systematic abuse. As my parents were led out of the house, Mrs. Henderson stayed close to me, explaining what was happening in terms I could understand. "Marcus, you're safe now," she said softly. "Those people aren't going to hurt you anymore. We're going to make sure you get proper food and medical care, and we're going to find you a family that will take good care of you." The paramedic began his examination while we talked, checking my vital signs and asking questions about how I'd been feeling physically. He was gentle and patient, explaining each test before performing it and making sure I understood that the medical attention was to help me feel better, not as another form of punishment. "When's the last time you had a full meal, Marcus?" James asked while checking my blood pressure. "I don't remember," I answered honestly. My parents said I needed to earn food by doing exercises and being grateful, but I was never very good at earning enough. The simplicity of my response, delivered without self-pity or dramatic emphasis, seemed to affect the adults around me more than any emotional outburst could have. Here was a 9-year-old child casually describing systematic starvation as if it were a normal part of childhood, completely unaware that what had been done to him was a serious crime. Dr. Walsh, who had arrived during the arrest, began a preliminary psychological assessment while the paramedic continued his medical evaluation. Her questions were carefully designed to gauge my understanding of normal family relationships and my expectations about how children should be treated by their parents. "Marcus, do you know other families where children have to crawl for food?" she asked gently. "No," I replied. "My parents said our family was special and that other kids were spoiled because their parents were too weak to teach them hard lessons. Do you think children should have to earn food by crawling?" I considered this question carefully, realizing for the first time that I'd never actually thought about whether our family's methods made sense compared to what I observed in other households. "I don't know," I said finally. "My parents said it was important, but other kids at school seem okay even though they don't have to do exercises for food." These conversations were being recorded as part of the official investigation, creating a record of my psychological state at the moment of rescue. Dr. Walsh was documenting evidence of the sophisticated brainwashing my parents had employed, showing how they'd convinced me that systematic abuse was actually beneficial treatment designed to help me become a better person. The house was quickly filling with investigators who began photographing and documenting evidence of the abuse. They found the bowls from that afternoon's game, several of which still contained contaminated food that would later be analyzed to determine exactly what substances my parents had been forcing me to consume. They discovered my parents' written logs documenting their punishment methods, their video collection of my humiliation sessions, and their notes planning future escalations of their abuse. In my bedroom, investigators found evidence of the additional punishments my parents had been inflicting. My mattress was missing, my belongings had been reduced to a few pieces of clothing and school supplies, and there were locks on the outside of my door that could be used to confine me to the room. The room itself was barely heated and contained no comfortable furniture, designed to be a place of additional suffering rather than rest and recovery. The paramedics' assessment confirmed what Mrs. Henderson's footage had suggested. I was severely underweight for my age, showing signs of chronic malnutrition, and exhibiting physical symptoms consistent with prolonged stress and abuse. I would need immediate medical intervention and careful nutritional rehabilitation to address the damage that months of systematic starvation had done to my developing body. But perhaps most importantly, the hidden camera footage that Mrs. Henderson had collected was providing investigators with irrefutable evidence of crimes that would have otherwise been nearly impossible to prove. Child abuse cases often come down to conflicting testimonies between parents and children, with authorities forced to make difficult decisions based on limited evidence. Mrs. Henderson's surveillance system had eliminated that uncertainty completely. The footage showed not just isolated incidents, but a comprehensive pattern of abuse that had been escalating over time. The audio recordings captured my parents planning their cruelty and celebrating my suffering, providing evidence of premeditation that would make their eventual prosecution straightforward. As I was being prepared for transport to the hospital for medical evaluation, Mrs. Henderson explained that she'd been watching over me even when I didn't know it, and that the evidence she'd collected would ensure my parents could never hurt me again. For the first time in years, I began to understand that what had been happening to me wasn't normal, wasn't my fault, and wasn't something I'd have to endure forever. The hidden camera footage had shattered my parents' carefully constructed lie, exposing the truth about what happened when they thought no one was watching. But this was only the beginning of a much larger story about justice, healing, and learning to trust that not all adults who claim to care about children were actually planning to hurt them. The evidence was overwhelming. The arrests had been made, and I was finally safe. But the legal battle that would determine my parents' punishment and my future was just beginning. And the community that had believed in the perfect Chen family was about to learn exactly what had been happening behind our closed doors. 6 months later, I sat in a courtroom watching my parents face the consequences of their hidden camera evidence. The prosecution presented Mrs. Henderson's footage to a jury that gasped audibly as they witnessed the systematic torture I'd endured. My father's face remained emotionless as video after video played, showing him laughing while I crawled and begged. My mother sobbed throughout the presentation, but not from remorse, from embarrassment that their private methods had been exposed. The defense attorney attempted to argue that my parents were simply strict disciplinarians using unconventional methods, but the recordings of them planning escalating abuse and celebrating my suffering destroyed any sympathy the jury might have had. When the footage of my final afternoon played, showing me forced to navigate their poisoned food game, several jurors looked away in disgust. Richard Chen received 8 years in prison. Patricia Chen received 6 years. Both were permanently barred from contact with children and placed on the state's child abuse registry. The sentences felt surreal to me. These people who had controlled my entire world reduced to case numbers in an orange jumpsuit. My new foster family, the Thompsons, in neighboring Riverside, treated food as something children simply received because they needed it. David and Susan Thompson had fostered 12 children over 15 years, specializing in cases involving severe neglect. They understood that my relationship with eating would require careful rehabilitation. The first time Susan Thompson told me to help myself to anything in the refrigerator, I stood paralyzed in their kitchen for 20 minutes, unable to believe that food could be freely available without earning it first. When I finally took a single apple, I asked permission 17 times before taking the first bite. "Marcus," Susan said gently, "in this house, you never have to ask permission to eat when you're hungry. Food isn't something you earn. It's something you deserve because you're a growing child who needs nutrition." Learning to eat normally took months of patient work. I'd hoard snacks under my bed until Susan explained that the food wouldn't disappear and that hoarding could actually make me sick. I'd eat too quickly, making myself nauseous, because part of me still expected each meal to be interrupted or taken away. Mrs. Henderson visited regularly during my recovery, bringing updates about the legal proceedings and helping me understand that the hidden camera footage had protected me when I couldn't protect myself. She'd saved my life by paying attention when no one else had noticed, and her evidence had ensured my parents could never hurt another child. "The cameras caught things that nobody else could have proven," she explained during one visit. "Your parents were very careful about hiding their actions from everyone except the one neighbor they didn't know was watching." 2 years later, I testified at my parents' parole hearings via video link, now 11 years old and living with a family that had adopted me permanently. I told the parole board that I still had nightmares about crawling for food, still struggled with feeling worthy of regular meals, and still couldn't understand how parents could find their child's suffering entertaining. Both parole requests were denied. Today, I'm 26 years old, married to an incredible woman named Jessica who understands my history and helps me continue healing from those childhood traumas. We're expecting our first child in 3 months, and I've spent considerable time in therapy ensuring that I understand how to be the parent I never had. Mrs. Henderson, now 81, remains one of my closest friends. Her decision to install security cameras after neighborhood break-ins inadvertently created the evidence that saved my life. Sometimes small acts of self-protection end up protecting others in ways we never anticipate. The hidden camera footage didn't just expose my parents' crimes. It proved that witnesses exist even when we think we're suffering alone. Someone is always watching, sometimes in ways that can save us when we least expect it. My parents thought their cruelty was private, But their neighbors' vigilance turned their secret torture into public evidence that destroyed them and freed me. Child abuse thrives in secrecy, but technology and caring neighbors can shatter that secrecy completely. The footage that documented my worst moments ultimately became the evidence that gave me my life back. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.